Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm just back from a trip to Black Squirrel Books where I came back with a little haul of 7 books here that I'm going to show you. So we'll start with the old dusty ones first. Got a couple of older books here. One was something that I hadn't heard of, but it piqued my interest enough to grab it. It's titled A Primer for Critics by George Bose. We've got this crest on the front because it's actually a university press. And we've got the title and author pasted onto the spine here. 1937, John Hopkins Press in Baltimore. And what's interesting about this little book, it's from 1937. But this is the third printing from 1947. So it was a successful enough book that it was reprinted several times. But what's interesting about it is it claims to be a guide to the vocabulary that a critic would need to critique art and literature and things of that sort. And so he says here, I just read the opening line here, the first chapter, which is titled Necessary Distinctions. He says the purpose of this essay is to provide a critical vocabulary for people who talk about the various arts. It is not to furnish them with a set of ready-made standards, which they can use in place of their own taste. So it's not about telling you how to critique things or what to think, but rather about focusing in on the kind of language that was used at the time. So for instance, the first subsection of this chapter is titled Ambiguity in the Word Art. The first ambiguity, which should be indicated as the word art, which means at times art as the process which terminates in the work of art, at other times art as the product in which it terminates. So the ambiguity, and I guess he's going to talk about the necessity of using the correct terms and actually knowing what you're talking about when setting out to become a critic. So we'll see what this book's all about. It was, as I said, popular enough that it went into 3 or 4 printings, at least by the time this edition came out. So there's that. The next one here, I'm going to admit the pasted on title on the spine is what caught my eye here. Universal Classics Library, Wisdom of Life by Schopenhauer. I've never read Schopenhauer. I've heard of Schopenhauer though. And what made me actually pick this up, this book is from 1901 by the way. What made me pick it up is this in the front of the book, which is a title page for the Universal Classics Library in general. So I imagine at the time multiple books in these editions would have been issued with various authors' works. The orange is quite nice, but what we have here is Universal Classics Library, Appleton Prentice Clark Griffin, Library of Congress Editorial Director. And this is the bit here, illustrated with photographs on Japan vellum, etchings, hand-painted India plate reproductions, and full-page portraits of authors. And so I found that quite interesting. And when you hold it, it really is a nice book. We've got this portrait here in the front of Schopenhauer, translated by Bailey Sanders and Ernest Belfort. And so it's a work called The Wisdom of Life, and other essays as well. So I'm assuming The Wisdom of Life is perhaps a short work or an essay of some sort. Nice deckled edges as well. But also, as I was looking through this in the shop, let me just see if I can find it again. There is a clipping, a newspaper clipping in here. I think it was somewhere around page 90. Or perhaps it was not. There we go. Page 93. It has, this newspaper clipping has discolored the pages where it's been wedged in there. So obviously it's been wedged for quite a while. But there's this little clipping here. Notice how to open a book from Modern Bookbinding. And the instructions here are: hold the book with its back on a smooth or covered table. Let the front board down, then the other, holding the leaves in one hand while you open a few leaves at the back, then a few at the front, and so on, alternately opening back and front, gently pressing down the section till you reach the center of the volume. Do this 3 or 4 times, or rather, do this 2 or 3 times, and you will obtain the best results. Open the volume violently or carelessly in any one place, and you will likely break the back and cause a start to the leaves. Never force the back of the book. A connoisseur many years ago, an excellent customer of mine, who thought he knew perfectly how to handle books, came into my office when I had an expensive binding just brought from the bindery, ready to be set home. Before my eyes, he took hold of the volume and, tightly holding the leaves in each hand, instead of allowing them to free play, violently opened it in the center and exclaimed, "How beautifully your bindings open!" I almost fainted. He had broken the back of the volume and it had to be rebound. And this little notice, this little clipping, was something that must have been widely shared at the time, because I know I've either read this elsewhere or I've heard somebody else read it aloud here on BookTube, because especially that little anecdote at the end about breaking the binding, I am certain I've heard that before. And so I wonder, perhaps, if at the time this book was originally sold, this is something that the bookseller would have handed to the buyer, instructions on how to gently begin to read their brand new book. And of course, modern bound books are made in such a way that you can just open them and read and go on your way. But older books that were certainly hand bound at the time seem to have required a bit more care, especially on the first reading through. But in terms of the contents of the book itself, there's quite an interesting table of contents here. So we have the wisdom of life, which, I mean, it looks like what it sounds like. There's sections on property or what a man has, reputation, pride, rank, honor, fame. But then we have essays on history of the doctrine and of the ideal of the real, some reflections on the antithesis of thing in itself and phenomenon, on philosophy and its method, on ethics, on the doctrine of the interdestructibility of our true nature by death, an essay on suicide, and an essay on contributions to the doctrine of the affirmation and negation of the will to live. And in the introduction here, the author goes on about how easy Schopenhauer is to read, and how accessible and how almost literary his writing was. So we'll see when I get into this, but it was too nice of a volume to pass up at the bookshop there. Probably not going to read Schopenhauer right away, but his name has been on the back burner of the philosophers I would like to read for quite a while. Then I went to the basement of Black Squirrel Books, and I dug through their section on literary criticism and literary biography. And that's where they often have a few books about books mixed in. Unfortunately, nothing too old, but they do have some more recent books on books. And I went down the stairs, turned the corner, started looking at the shelves, and that basement is just chocked full of books, to the point where you can't even look at anything that's on the very bottom layer of the shelf near the floor, because they've got stacks piled up on the floor in front of the shelves. But on the top of one of those floor stacks was this one, which coincidentally someone had dropped this into the comments of a video I posted earlier this week. and I was reminded that it's something I've been wanting to pick up for a while. So this is A History of Reading by Alberto Manguel, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It is a book about reading. So let's take a look at the table of contents here. So we have sections on silent readers, memory, on learning to read, on missing first pages, reading through pictures, on being read to, on the shape of books, private reading, metaphors in reading, beginnings, reading the future, the symbolic reader, reading within walls, stealing books, which I think is going to be a chapter I enjoy quite a bit, the author as reader, the translator as reader, forbidden reading, and the book fool. And it looks like there's some pretty good pictures and illustrations throughout this volume. So for instance, there, just in black and white because this is just a paperback, but it looks like there's going to be many great hours of interesting reading and digging into the history of the act of reading. And I've heard great things about this book in the past, so I'm glad to be adding it to my collection. Next up, I have a book that I think is technically a children's book, but it was only $5 and it piqued my interest enough that I thought I would pick it up. And this is Exploring the Book of Kells, which is a very early manuscript from Europe. I believe it is the Gospel, so the first 4 books of the Christian New Testament. And it is a beautiful manuscript, great illustrations. Definitely something that's well known, and I believe it is in a library somewhere in Ireland, because I think that's where it's sourced from. But as you can tell, I don't have too much knowledge of the Book of Kells, and so for $5 I thought I would pick up this little volume here and learn a bit more about it. Oh, there we go. Illustration there. It's definitely a book geared towards children. This is a 2004 printing, but it looks like it was originally published in 1888 by the O'Brien Press in Ireland. But as I said, it is for children, so the writing is quite simple. When I opened it up here, it begins by saying, the making of the Book of Kells. Who made the Book of Kells? It tells you what the Book of Kells is, and then it goes on to explain what a monastery is and what a scriptorium is. So definitely geared towards children, simplistic language, but we do have some wonderful color illustrations in the center of the book, which is really what made it worth it to buy for the $5 for me. And it'll serve my collection well until I can find perhaps a better book on the Book of Kells that's more detailed and actually geared towards adults. So I added that to my collection. Next up is a book titled Novel Destinations, a travel guide to literary landmarks from Jane Austen's Bath to Ernest Hemingway's Key West, by Shannon McKenna Schmidt and Joni Rendon. And curiously enough, there were actually 2 editions of this book on the shelf at Black Squirrel. And I actually picked up the first edition first because it was, it was yellow and I saw it first on the shelf. And I had it in my arms with my other books, and then I saw this and I thought, oh, that looks like the same book, but it's a different color and it's slightly thicker. And I wondered at first, is it the difference between the US and the UK edition? But no, the yellow one was the first edition, and this is the second edition, which has been revised, corrected, and expanded a bit. And I thought, well, I'll get the second edition if it has indeed been updated. And it literally seems to be a guide to locations, to houses and whatnot. So it's almost like an encyclopedia of places, or well, a literal travel guide. So we have, for instance, Oak Park, Illinois. Ernest Hemingway was born in the middle-class Chicago suburb of Oak Park in 1899. Ernest Hemingway Birthplace, Home, and Museum. On the opposite page, we have an entry for Shakespeare and Company in Paris. Flipping through a bit here, the British Library, French Quarter Literary History Tour, Tennessee Williams New Orleans Literary Festival, Shakespeare's birthday celebration. And so it seems to be a collection of literary landmarks, so physical places that you might want to visit if you're interested in a certain author, but also a guide to existing literary festivals and things to do if you like a certain author or a certain literary movement. So perhaps not something I read through all the way through in one go. Perhaps it's something I make use of the index in the back for. Or, if I'm ever planning a trip somewhere or thinking about where I might want to plan a trip, perhaps this is something that could be consulted to see if there is a particular landmark or festival that I would want to go to. And they put the Black Squirrel Books sticker right on the back there, which does annoy me a bit. When I first started going to Black Squirrel Books, they didn't have their own stickers yet. And so they would pencil the prices in on one of the end papers of the books, which that's a common practice at used bookstores. And then they got their own pricing gun stickers, which is neat, but they're not always careful about the placement of the stickers. So for instance, I picked up an Everyman's Library edition, one of those pocket-sized ones, from the 1940s or 50s. Not something I particularly wanted to buy, but I thought I would take a look because the fact that the dust jacket was intact caught my eye. But I picked it up, and they had just put one of their stickers onto that very delicate, fragile 70-year-old dust jacket. And I was like, oh, that's not great, because with the condition of that dust jacket, I could see no way that sticker could possibly be peeled off after purchase by anyone without doing significant damage to that already fragile dust jacket. So I almost prefer when they go and they put the sticker inside the book, or at least in a more discreet area. And I would think with some of their books they would still want to do the penciled in thing just to avoid causing damage. But perhaps, it's just one of those bookstores where most people wouldn't care. Most people who want to read Madame Bovary or whatever it was would probably just purchase the book and discard the dust jacket and go with it. But that aside, on to the next book here. This is a book on the history of paper. The Paper Trail, an unexpected history of a revolutionary invention by Alexander Monroe. And it does have some red ink on it because it looks like it was remaindered at some point and somebody's marker wandered up onto the cover of the book itself. But this book, the back says it's tracing the history of paper from when it was invented by the Chinese and looking at perhaps how it's changed the course of human events. Tracing the emergence of paper from the imperial court of Han China to its subsequent journeys to Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, through the empire of the Abbasid Caliphate, and eventually by way of the Silk Road to Europe in the late 13th century. A sweeping, richly detailed, and vividly written tale populated by holy men and scholars, warriors and poets, rulers and ordinary men and women. Here is the story not only of paper, but of human culture itself. So that sounds quite lofty, but we'll see how this one is. I know there's another book out there that I think is also on the history of paper. And I remember borrowing borrowing it from the library in 2015 or 2016. But I don't think it was this one, because that book was a new released hardcover and it was much bigger, and I think there was a lot more in it than just the early history of paper. But I could be remembering wrong, and maybe it was just this one in the hardcover edition. But I could have sworn that it wasn't called The Paper Trail and that the title was literally just Paper. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, do let me know in the comments below. And then I have one more here, which is titled Printer's Error, Irreverent Stories from the Book History. J.P. Romney and Rebecca Romney, rare book specialists from Pawn Stars. And I could care less about the fact that they've been on that Pawn Stars TV show. And I'm not entirely sure how good this one is going to be. Because first of all, the dust jacket is this cheap paper that feels like watercolor paper or like sketchbook paper. It's that odd textured thing, not very nice. The dust jacket itself is just atrocious. I don't know what they were thinking, the design of it. Not very attractive. In fact, I'm probably, if I read it and want to keep it, I'm probably going to discard this and just shelve it like this. It's a little bit more attractive that way. But this is a book published by Harper & Collins in 2017. In terms of quality, paper, thin, cheap, and one of the font styles that I tend to hate. I find this font appears time and time again in cheap books everywhere, the kind of books that you stumble upon in the dollar store eventually when all the remainders get booted out. And speaking of remainders, Sharpie mark on the bottom, which indicates this probably was remaindered at some point. But I'm hoping there's some good stuff in it, some interesting stories at the very least. And I don't think the dust jacket even says much about the contents. Rare book specialist Rebecca Romney and author J.P. Romney take us from monasteries and museums to auction houses and libraries to introduce curious episodes in the history of print. Print history, like any history, is full of strange people and goings-on. The road paved by our civilization's best books is a long and noble one, but it is also lined with unexpected potholes and sharp turns into what the hell is going on here territory. Illustrators talking to ghosts, maps bringing countries to their knees, Shakespeare writing awful plays, and Charles Dickens branding America a nation of filthy literary thieves all serve as the back alleys into which authors could descend. Correction, into which the authors did descend. Consider that today a Gutenberg Bible is the holy grail of book collecting, but that wasn't always so. James Lennox, a New York millionaire, sent an agent to bid on his behalf at a London auction in 1847. At that point, no one had ever paid more than £215 for a Gutenberg Bible. His agent became embroiled in a bidding war, and when the dust settled, Lennox was on the hook for an eye-popping £500. Lennox was so angry about the exorbitant sticker price that he flatly refused to pay it. Eventually he came around, which was clearly the right choice, since a Gutenberg Bible would sell for tens of millions of dollars today. Among the many other tales told in Printer's Error are the story of the man who coined the term Atlas, who is also responsible for generations of Europeans believing that little people inhabited the Arctic. The history of the bad versions of Shakespeare plays, including a Hamlet who sounds more like a drunken pirate than a prince, and the fate of William Tyndale, who made the Holy Bible accessible to countless worshippers, and was also burned at the stake for heresy. The author scoured 500 years of book history and collected some of its most absurd episodes. And then, like so many humans before them, they wrote a book about it. So we'll see if there's anything new in here to me. Everything on the dust jacket, those are stories I'm already familiar with. But I'm hoping there's going to be something of interest in here. And it was only $8, so if it's utter trash, it's not too much of a loss, but I thought I would throw it in with my stack of books because it's right up my alley and right up in line with some of the things I've been interested in reading lately. So that is my little haul here. A number of books about books to add to my books about books collection, and a couple of interesting older books that caught my eye.